Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be talking about some of the underrated gems I read this year. I also read a lot of overrated books that I will talk about in a separate video, but today we are going to be giving attention to books that deserve more hype, more reviews, more people talking about them. So let's jump in. The first book is a sci-fi book and that is The Vanishing Birds by Simon Jimenez. This is probably, if not, one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. It is absolutely incredible. And the fact that this was Jimenez's debut is absolutely insane. It is just one of the most lyrical, poetic books I've ever read. The thematic work that it covers, humanity, relationships, are just approached in a very sensitive way. It's one of those books that I've been thinking about weeks and months after I finished it. It's just really fantastic. The next book is a fantasy book and that is The 36 Streets by T.R. Napa. T.R. Napa, I feel like, seems to be quite an underrated author, and I think this book is really good. I think it's a really solid standalone. It's set in a kind of fantasy version of Hanoi in Vietnam, and in Hanoi there is this kind of section of the city that is called the 36th Street. So it's based on a real place, so it is kind of urban fantasy, but it's also got a cyberpunky element to it. It kind of crosses multiple genres and I think he approaches it in a really smart way. I really like the thematic work that is covered in this book. There's a lot of stuff around like PTSD, specifically about the PTSD that soldiers get after war. There's also a kind of thread around virtual reality games and whether hyper-realistic experiences are ever actually a good thing. There's also another thread around kind of like personal identity and kind of knowing your place, knowing who you are. So it's very layered. It's a very layered story that I just have never heard anybody else talk about. And I think a lot of you who like grim, dark fantasy that's quite edgy, I think you would really like this one. It's also a standalone, so you don't have to commit to anything too long. All right, next we have The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. So this is a Japanese translated fiction and it is very much dystopian. It's set in a world where people essentially forget different objects, different everyday objects at any moment in time. And you wouldn't think that that would make a big difference, but what we realise through our characters, especially through our main character, is that it's the banality, it's the very boring stuff that we expect to have. When those things go, like actually it can impact our world in a way that maybe we didn't anticipate. And I think that's just such an interesting concept that I've never thought about. Like, as an example, one of the things that happens is eggs disappear. And you wouldn't think like, oh, eggs are going to disappear, that's going to be the biggest deal in the world. But no, it really would be. I use eggs a lot in my cooking, so I'd be screwed basically. All right, it's really good. It's also short. I think it's about 200 pages long and it definitely packs a punch. Next up, we have Seat of Souls by N.C. Scrimshaw. This is a self-published fantasy that I read earlier this year. I absolutely loved it. One of the many things I love about this book is, and this author's writing style, is there's this aura of mystery. It's quite mystical, quite mythical. There's a sense of, ooh, what is happening? And it's really magical. Like, I don't know how else to explain it aside from the fact that it is very magical and it feels almost not whimsical, but I don't know, ethereal? I don't know, that's not the right word, but I don't know, maybe you get where I'm going with that. There's just something about it that I haven't really seen captured in the fantasy that I typically read that I just absolutely fell in love with. It is very much inspired by Scottish folklore, I believe. So there is this kind of rich lore surrounding the world that we're just getting the beginning of, and I'm really excited to see how it continues in the later books. Absolutely fantastic, wonderful writing, strongly recommend. Also quite dark. Next up, we have The African Samurai by Craig Shreve. This is also another book that I read in the first half of this year and I really loved it. I have mentioned this before, I've really been getting into Japanese history. I am learning Japanese myself, and so as a kind of natural consequence of that, you kind of get more interested in the culture, the history, what's happening there today, all of these kinds of things. And The African Samurai is following the life of a real life person who went by the name of Yasuke. And he essentially got taken into, I guess, the court of Oda Nobunaga, who was one of the key players in liberating Japan. And it's just a really fascinating story set against this very politically interesting time in Japan's history. So I really like the contrast between this like broader context, this broader historical context, but then also this very intimate relationship that we get between Yasuke and Nobunaga. So I really like this historical fiction book, and I'm really excited to see what Craig Shreve does next. Next up, we have The Mermaid's Tale by D.G. Valdron. This is a fantasy book, a grim, dark fantasy book, and it is so good. So good. I have not heard anybody speaking about this book. It's absolutely fantastic. The writing is fantastic. The thematic work is really fantastic. It's all about an outsider who's trying to basically solve a crime. This character is not really accepted anywhere, and we see the impact that it has on this character. There's a lot of commentary on kind of race and acceptance, and it's done in a really subtle way, and I really love it. It's there if you want to deep dive into that. If you want to read it just like a fantasy book and you don't really care about that, that's fine. But it's not so in your face that, you know, you're presented with it, if that makes sense. It's very dark, very dark, but I think a lot of you who watch my YouTube channel would really like it, specifically the folks who like dark fantasy, grim dark fantasy. Fantastic. Next up, we have A Quiet Vengeance by Tim Hardy. I've talked about this book so much on my channel now, like it's getting boring at this point, but I will never get bored of saying that how much I love this book. I read this book in a day. I missed the gym to read this book. I woke up earlier than I normally wake up, and I wake up early already to finish this book because I wanted to finish it before I started work. It's just so good. It's just so good. Like, I've read Tim's other series. I haven't finished it yet. I've read the first 2 books of Tim's other series, and he published this one, I think, after his 3rd book got published. And it's just so impressive to see his writing evolve in the way that it has. And he's very quickly becoming an author that I can just trust to get the job done and to tell the story in a really compelling way. That's exactly what he does in A Quiet Vengeance. It's a very contained story. It's set in the same world as the Brotherhood and the Eagle series, but in a different part of the world. It is a standalone, and we are following 2 different POVs of people who are on kind of opposite sides of life. One comes from a very well-to-do background, one comes from a very poor background, and it's all about kind of the political landscape of the place that we're in. It's fascinating, it's very character-driven, and I strongly recommend it. All right, we have 3 more left. We have A City Dreaming by Daniel Plansky. Daniel Plansky is an author that I've talked about quite a lot on my channel. I adore his writing. I'm going to read more of his books next year, which I'm very excited about. I'm actually planning to read his newest book that is coming out, I think, in end of Q1 next year. I have an arc for it. So I'm hoping to read that maybe over Christmas, assuming I finish all the series that I want to finish. But A City Dreaming, I think, is just one of those books that I would just describe as a fun, good time. With Polanski, I can trust that his writing is going to be really solid, so I have nothing to worry about in that regard. The thing I have to worry about is whether one of my favourite authors is going to do justice to the characters. And I really shouldn't have had any doubt, because he did do justice to the characters. Like, it was so well done. I loved our main character. I loved the surrounding cast of characters. Everything worked. It was a good book to read in between really heavy things that I was reading at the time. And I think a lot of you who like Abercrombie and you like wit and like quite fast-paced books with just like incredibly witty writing, you're going to love this. So I strongly recommend it for that reason. Next up, we have the Alamaxo Geology by Hadia Elsbai. So I reviewed the first book at the start of this year. My review of the second book may or may not be out already. I don't know. The point is that I think this duology is a really solid duology. I think it's great for fans of the David Bad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. I think it's one of those series that it doesn't do a lot, but I think what it does do, it does very well. And I think it's one of those books that it's not very mentally taxing, even though it is talking about some quite heavy things. There's a lot of discussion around, again, kind of finding your place, knowing who you are, embracing the things that make you different. There's a lot of discussion around like the place of magic in this world. There's a lot of discussion around like the point of government and whether governments are really representing the people they should be representing, or whether they're just there, you know, feeding their own interests, which, let's be honest, is pretty much every government to have ever existed, right? So it's got some really interesting commentary, but it's not a heavy duology. Like, I think you can read it pretty quickly. Characters are very enjoyable to read, and yeah, I just think it's a really solid duology, and I'm really excited to see what this author does next. Last but most certainly not least, we have The Bloodstones by Tori Tekken. This is a self-published book by a booktuber in our community, Tori. And I really like this book. I think it's a really solid start to the series. I haven't read Tori's other books, but I have a feeling she's probably evolved quite a lot as an author. And it's really great to see somebody that we know who loves fantasy write fantasy well as well. It is very much a new release, but I think it's quite dark. It's covering some really interesting themes. It's got some interesting character types that are quite typical to fantasy, but I quite like Tori's take on them thus far. So definitely check that one out. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Those are just some underrated recommendations that I think you should all check out that I've read this year. If you have any underrated recs, please drop me a comment down below. I would definitely consider checking them out. And yeah, please give this video a thumbs up and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe. As always, take care and I'll see you soon. Bye.